Yes, I got
Peter?
no, I hit the button. Does the green camera up in my upper right mean that it is recording?
You're
Uh,
recording now. A
Great.
notice just came up that it is.
Super. Thank you.
yeah, at least I'm recording it anyway.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Nice to see you all. We're launching now on Richard III. This is one place that I disturbed chronology a little bit. Richard was probably written a year or two before Romeo and Juliet, but sort of for the arc that I'm trying to describe, um, this seemed like the way to do it. Just as I said in Romeo and Juliet that I felt it was a big step forward in Shakespeare being able to characterize his personages by use of language. And I tried to show how the nurse, how Juliet, how Capulet speak in idioms that distinguish them, beyond just a speech prefix. And one thing you can try to do is acquire an actor's ear for how the speech, as you're reading to yourself, you might even move your lips or you might even speak it out loud in an effort to understand the dynamics of how the language functions in performance. And I'm going to kick one off right off the top by saying, okay, this play probably premiered in the theater, which was one of only two or three active theaters in London. This is essentially at the dawn of the Elizabethan theater golden age. And it's where several of Shakespeare's first plays were produced, and Richard III among them. Now, the thing I want you to remember is that the audience coming in for the first performance of Richard III had, within the last year probably, they had seen the last installment of the three Henry VI plays. Now, it's thought that Shakespeare collaborated on those plays, that a playwright named Nash wrote a good hunk of Henry VI Part One, and that Christopher Marlowe teamed with Shakespeare especially in Part Two, and some into Part Three. I've already spoken about Marlowe being the king of the London theater when Shakespeare arrived. It obviously did not take long for him to go into an alliance with him. Um, and Excuse me. Plays that made it into the folio were put together by Shakespeare's collaborators and are thought to sort of constitute the canon. But several of those plays, including the Henry Sixes, including probably Macbeth and Measure for Measure, and certainly Henry VIII, and a few others have other hands in them because collaboration was more the rule in the Elizabethan theater than the exception. So um, I believe that Shakespeare had written most of Henry VI, Part 3, and the audiences that had seen it and were coming back to see Richard III, I think were much like we were when we were tuning into the final episode of The Sopranos, which, as you may remember, was a big event. And everybody wanted to know how it would come out. Now, uh, much of the uh, London audience knew a fair amount about English history, and they knew somewhat what to expect. There had even been an earlier play about Richard III, which is undistinguished, but uh, they were expecting a lot from this final version, largely because the character of Richard had been developed over the last scenes of Henry VI, Part 2, and throughout Henry VI, Part 3, as the character, as Richard of Gloucester, was the character who is going to be Richard III. We all know that. And I printed some of his dialogue from Henry VI-3, but I'm going to give it to you live because I think it's worth listening to. So here's a couple of passages of soliloquies of Richard of Gloucester. The first is from Act 3, I think. The second is from Act 5 of Henry VI-3. And this sets up the expectations of the audience as they file into the theater to see what is Richard going to do next. You know now, having read the play, that he's not really the king until at the beginning of Act 4. So he's still the conniving Richard of Gloucester that we've been introduced to with speeches like this. Why, then I do but dream on sovereignty. Well, say there is no kingdom then for Richard. What other pleasures can the world afford? I'll make my heaven in a lady's lap, and deck my body in gay ornaments, and witch sweet ladies with my words and looks. Oh, miserable thought, and more unlikely than to accomplish 20 golden crowns. Why, love forswore me in my mother's womb, and, for I should not deal in her soft laws, she did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back, where sits deformity, to mock my body, to shape my legs of an unequal size, to disproportion me in every part, like to a chaos, or an unlicked bear whelp that carries no impression like the dam. And am I then a man to be beloved? O monstrous thought, to harbor such a thought. Then, since this earth affords no joy to me, but to command, to check, to o'erbear such as are of better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown. And whiles I live to account this world but hell, until my misshaped trunk that bears this head be round impaled with a glorious crown. And yet I know not how to get the crown. For many lives stand between me and home, and I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rents the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown. And from that torment I will free myself, or hew my way out with a bloody axe. Why, I can smile, and murder whiles I smile, and cry content to that which grieves my heart, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions. I'll drown more sailors than the mermaid shall. I'll slay more gazers than the basilisk. I'll play the orator as well as Nestor, deceive more slyly than Ulysses could, and like a Sinon take another Troy. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Footnote on Machiavel. I'm going to go into that in a moment. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut! Were it further off, I'd pluck it down. And then just after he's killed Henry in the next to last scene of Henry VI-3, if any spark of life be yet remaining, down, down to hell, and say I sent thee thither, I that have neither pity, love, nor fear. Indeed, 'tis true that Henry told me of. For I have often heard my mother say, I came into the world with my legs forward. Had I not reason, think ye, to make haste, and seek their ruin that usurped our right? The midwife wondered, and the women cried, Oh, Jesu, bless us, he is born with teeth. And so I was, which plainly signified that I should snarl and bite and play the dog. Then since the heavens have shaped my body so, let hell make crooked my mind to answer it. I have no brother. I am like no brother. And this word love, which graybeards call divine, be resident in men like one another and not in me. I am myself alone. King Henry and the prince his son are gone. Clarence, thy turn is next, and then the rest, counting myself but bad till I be best. So that's the cliffhanger that we ended on in Henry VI-3. So I imagine in the audience there's a considerable eagerness to see where we're going to go from here. And where we go from here is another soliloquy. There is no character in Shakespeare, I believe, including Hamlet, who has as many soliloquies as Richard does. And I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about the power of soliloquy in the Elizabethan theater. Now, we're used to a theater in which we go and sit in the dark, and then a curtain goes up or the lights come on, and there's a lit space into which we look. And, you know, the name of that relationship has been called the fourth wall, that there's an invisible wall between us and the actors. And of course, in the case of realistic sets, we're looking into a room with three sides, and we understand that there is a fourth, which is transparent to us. The Elizabethan theater is wholly different. Performances take place under the sky, usually at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So what lighting there is furnished by heaven. There's no way of enhancing sound. Interestingly, when you read Elizabethan era writers and they talk about going to the theater, very often they'll say, I went to hear a play. Now, we normally would say, I went to see a play. But the emphasis on hearing, I think, is an indication that the language was paramount in the Elizabethan theater, because the language had to do for you what scenery and special effects and lighting could not. We'll find this particularly keenly in the next play, which is Midsummer Night's Dream, 2/3 of which takes place at night in the forest. But in fact, in Shakespeare's theater is the same brightly lit stage in the middle of the daytime. And therefore, the language has to work to create the environment in which magical things can happen. So that's for the month of March. Sticking to where we are now, I want to remind you also that the capacity of a good-sized Elizabethan theater was probably close to 2,000 people. And those who could afford it would pay a shilling, and they could be seated in the galleries which surrounded the stage, surrounded the open space in front of the stage. And that space was filled up by groundlings who would pay a penny, and probably they would arrive early, because the best seats in the house in the Elizabethan theater are not seats at all. They are positions close to the stage. That's where you hear the best, and that's where you can see most closely. The people paying, a shilling or two are 50 feet from the stage, but you as a groundling are right up against it. It's probably about chest level. So that's how close you are to the actors. And what playwrights begin to find out, and Shakespeare really develops, is the intimacy that comes from the actor being able to speak directly to the audience. And it's more than intimacy, it's kind of a collusion. It starts, I don't know, a good starting point is the speech that opens Henry V, which is over a muse of fire that would attend the brightest heaven of invention. And he talks about all the things that the stage can't do. But if you free your imagination, think when we speak of horses that you see them printing their proud hoofs to the receiving earth. There is a collaborative relationship set up between the acting company and the audience. And what they are saying is essentially suspend your disbelief. There's an old phrase, probably from the Romantic period, but it applies. Use your imagination and we'll do the rest. We will furnish you the language that will free your imagination to really believe you are there and witnessing the events that we're presenting. And the next step beyond that is the character of a character like Richard III. I mentioned he set the murderous Machiavel to school. Most of you know who Niccolò Machiavelli was. Italian Renaissance writer. His famous work is The Prince, and he basically speaks about what we'd call now realpolitik, how you actually advance and get things done in a feudal kind of power arrangement. And the book is directed at rulers, but also anyone who aspires to be a ruler or to influence a ruler. This book got a terrible, terrible reputation all over Europe. It was quite a sensation. It was translated into many languages, and it fed into a perception, especially in England, of Renaissance Italy being this stew pot of intrigue, murder, poisoning, incest, you name it. And Machiavelli's name got attached to this. So much so that Christopher Marlowe, who may have had a small hand in this play, 3 or 4 years earlier had written a play called The Jew of Malta. And I won't go into the plot of that, just to tell you that there is a prologue, as there often is in a Shakespeare play, and the prologue is spoken by Machiavel. He becomes this personation of all that is twisted, evil, conniving, and despicable in Italian political life. So when he says, I'll set the murderous Machiavel to school, he says, I'm going to outdo Machiavelli. Now, the fact is that Machiavelli, when this play was produced, as I say, had a major influence, but when at the time the play is set, say, beginning with the coronation of Edward IV, Machiavelli was 6 years old. So we got creative anachronism here. Shakespeare does this every once in a while. He has a character quoting Aristotle in Troilus and Cressida, which is about the Trojan War, and therefore about 600 years before Aristotle. But he's making his point. Everybody knows what he means by Machiavel. It becomes a touchstone. And to say that I'm going to exceed Machiavel, to go beyond him, is very provocative. It's quite a promise to make. So the play begins with events surrounding the coronation of Edward. In the Olivier film, the coronation is sort of the first thing that happens, and Richard steps out of it. I have heard of productions of Henry VI in which, as the curtain goes down, Richard comes down stage and begins, "Now is the winter of our," and that makes palpable the promise of what is to come. Now, it's from that springboard, from that starting point, that Richard starts off. So it's completely appropriate that he begins the play and speaks directly to the audience. I'm going to do a little sideboard here and say that his first line is often misquoted, not quoted wrong, but quoted out of context. I've heard many times the winter of our discontent invoked to mean the terrible time we're having now. But the second line makes it clear that he's talking about something that has just ended. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, with the pun on sun in the sky and the sun, the direct descendant of the Duke of York, who died in the last play, and whose sons basically carried on the fight until they defeated the Lancastrians and murdered the king and his heir. So the Wars of the Roses are over, or are they? They're called the Roses, and Shakespeare dramatizes it by having two parties in a legal dispute pluck a white rose and a red rose off of rose bushes in the Inns of Court and use them as their emblems. But in fact, those were the white rose and the red rose were the images, the symbols of the houses of York and Lancaster. And eventually, when Henry VII takes the throne, he combines the two into what's called the Tudor rose, that has the red and the white together. That symbolizes the final settlement of the War of the Roses. But what we're seeing here is really sort of an end action around the Wars of the Roses, because the Lancasters have finally been defeated, but there is still unrest in the kingdom. Though the Yorks are in charge now of the government, it's not good enough for Richard. He needs to be the top man. So he launches off. Now we're finally, I've spoken enough about the run-up, and now here we are. With Edward on the throne, his younger brothers Clarence and Richard being dukes, and most importantly, he has taken a wife whom they regard as a commoner. She's actually from the minor gentry, but they had gone to all this trouble to set up a French marriage with the heir to the French crown for Edward to consolidate his political position, and instead he suddenly falls for this widow who comes with a petition to him and marries her on the spot. And she brings with her a bunch. Her name is Elizabeth Woodville. She's now Queen Elizabeth, and she's brought with her basically the king's in-laws. Think of the names Rivers, Dorset, and Grey, who are various children, nephews, brothers, and brothers of hers, and who now wield a fair amount of influence in Edward's government, and much to the hatred of both Clarence and Richard and their party, who felt it was an inappropriate marriage and that the The Queen's people are social climbers. I'll take a moment to say in the McKellen film, he cast American actors, as Annette Bening as Elizabeth and Robert Downey, among others, as her family, to emphasize the sense of their being outsiders and being faintly looked down on by the rest of the British royal family. So, Richard takes about 8 lines to set up, the wars are finally over. Isn't that great? Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front, and now instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, he, and this could be ambiguous, it could mean war, or it could mean Edward, capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. You'll hear a good deal about Mistress Shore, Jane Shore, was the king's pretty much acknowledged mistress. And she seems to have complicated things by also carrying on an affair with the Lord Hastings, who is a high court official and whom we'll meet pretty soon. So Mistress Shore is having affairs with 2 powerful men in government, including the king, and is also despised by the core family of the Yorks. So after, as I say, these 8 lines or so about everything is hunky-dory now, Richard goes back to the old theme. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph. There's some incel language in here too. It seems to me in here and in the other one about I'll make my living in a lady's lap with scorn, saying, you know, no woman is ever going to love me, let's face it. So I'm going to direct my energies elsewhere to murder and usurpation. I that am rudely stamped and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. For those of you who are into verse, that last line is one of the most interesting lines anywhere in Shakespeare. It breaks a couple of rules of iambic pentameter. It puts, I'm not going to get too technical, it puts trochees in the 2nd and 5th foot where they're never supposed to be and disrupts the flow of the language. Let me say it again, that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Halt means limp. And the verse itself there limps. And if I were an actor on stage, I would take a couple of steps to illustrate why some people call him the bottled spider, that he scuttles along rather than walking. Different actors playing different Richards have interpreted this in different ways. For instance, McKellen goes the route of doing everything he can to hide his deformity. And although there's a useless limb, a left hand, I think that he can't use at all, he's very skillful at covering it up. Whereas other actors have made a thing of it. It's open to interpretation. Okay. So he says, I have no delight to pass away the time except to see my shadow in the sun and descant on mine own deformity, which is exactly what he's doing. And therefore, since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain. So, our first introduction to the entire cast is Richard himself. It's no surprise. We saw him in the other plays. We saw his trajectory. We saw what he was aiming at, and now we're picking up right where we left off. And now if we know any English history, we're licking our chops a little bit because we're saying now we're going to hear how he does it. And there's a persistent pattern with Richard of him coming to the audience and saying, I'm going to do something that you think is not even possible, but just watch. And then he does it, manipulates someone, seduces someone, murders someone. He comes back to the audience again and says, see, I told you I was going to do that. And all of this, I think, sifts into the remarkable connection that a star actor can have on the Elizabethan stage. The actor in this case was Richard Burbage, who would go on to play Hamlet, Lear, Othello, bunch of the great leading roles, Antony probably. Still young, but an extremely accomplished actor, and who worked closely with Shakespeare, obviously, for many years as a member of his company, which was first the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and after the accession of James I became the King's Men, a very favored group that could count on court patronage to make up the shortfalls which the Elizabethan theater inevitably occurred, because every once in a while another wave of plague would come through London and the city fathers would shut down all the theaters. And the actors either have to go home to the provinces. Shakespeare probably went back to Stratford and worked on The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis because he didn't need actors for that. Or went touring in the provinces where the plague had not yet reached. But the life of an Elizabethan theater manager was constant turmoil. Because the theaters are being closed intermittently, because Burbage, this is now the father of the actor Burbage, James Burbage, who built the theater where this play probably was premiered in Shoreditch, which is, let's say roughly a mile north of the Tower of London. Not on the South Bank where they built the Globe eventually. And train of thought. The royal, I was saying why royal patronage or noble patronage at the court was so essential to theater companies. Therefore, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the Queen's Men, early in Shakespeare's career, and then eventually the King's Men, show that. Thanks largely to Elizabeth, who was a theater fan, the theater community had powerful friends at court who were helping out when things got thin or difficult. There are many stories that I won't go into now about how that happened. All right. So just back to this sense of collusion with the audience. Richard acts not only as the key central player in this drama, but also the only one who can directly speak to the audience. That's what we call a soliloquy, is an actor on stage alone, and he is, quote, talking to himself, or to be more accurate, he's really speaking directly to the audience. And that creates a very powerful connection that the character can trade on. And Richard, while he is morally despicable in sort of every dimension you can think of, who does terrible things who hurts people, who seduces people, who lies to everyone. Nevertheless, he keeps coming back to the audience in soliloquy and continuing to build this bond that he has with the audience. And he can trade on that very successfully. Now, I talked about Machiavel and how he even turns up in an Elizabethan drama. But there's a second progenitor for Richard in the English theater, and it's a whole class of characters called the Vice. And the Vice starts in the old mystery plays, usually as a minor devil. You know, Satan himself doesn't go to tempt some duke or king. You know, he sends a subordinate, a minor devil. And these vice characters started to become very popular in the medieval drama. I think because they come from hell, sometimes they had fireworks that were rigged to seem like they were propelling themselves. I'm trying not to get too specific here, too graphic here. Um, the But the Vice, who at first I say is a minor devil, he begins to expand into other characters. And as we talk about Shakespeare going forward, we're going to find different characters who are different kinds of descendants of the Vice character. One is the villains. And with Richard III, we have a good example, but there's already been one in Aaron the Moor in Titus Andronicus, and we will soon see Don John in Much Ado About Nothing, and notably Iago and the character Iachimo in Cymbeline, who are often Italian typed, but are different kinds of conniving villains. Those are one offspring of the Vice. A second tradition that comes out of the Vice is the fool or the clown, especially the professional fool, as we have Touchstone in As You Like It, and Feste in Twelfth Night, and the fool in Lear, and Lavache, for instance, the Countess's fool in All's Well That Ends Well, who are witty characters. They don't partake of the evil of the Vice, but they do of the kind of trickery and contrarian quality that these little worker devils used to have. So I want you to think of Richard as a character who reaches a synthesis between the Italian Machiavellian villain on the one side and the diabolical trickster on the other, and weds it into a single character. The word vice is used somewhere in the play, but I can't remember exactly where it comes up, but that makes it a little more explicit. All right. So now I'm going to sort of go through the next few scenes and talk about how Shakespeare is building his plot. It's 5:43. Okay. The first one is Clarence. Along comes Clarence, right on the end of his Richard's first soliloquy, and he's under guard. And Richard asks why, and he says, well, I'm being taken to the Tower. And this funny little exchange proceeds. Say, what's the matter, Clarence? May I know? And he says, yes, Richard, when I know, for I protest as yet I do not. But as I can learn, he hearkens after prophecies and dreams, and from the cross-row plucks the letter G, and says a wizard told him that by G his issue disinherited should be. And since my name of George begins with G, it follows in his thought that I am he. Clarence obviously is able to find a certain amount of humor in his situation, even as he's being dragged off to prison. The Tower appears a lot in this play. It's to be remembered by us, I think, that the Tower already had a little bit of a dark reputation, but the time at which There are lots and lots of executions at the Tower, notably during the reign of Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, all of their named lovers and so forth. They loved executing people, and they executed them either on the Tower Green or up on Tower Hill. So the Tower, by Shakespeare's time, had acquired an even more sinister reputation. But the Tower was always a royal residence, and just a well-fortified one. So to be sent to the Tower was not a death sentence. Plenty of people went to the Tower and stayed there for a while and got out. But it's worrisome to be sent to the Tower. Some bad things have happened there, and you're completely out of touch with whatever your support group might be. So off goes Clarence to the Tower, and Richard essentially condemns him to death with a short little soliloquy. Go, tread the path that thou shalt ne'er return. Simple, plain Clarence, I do love thee so that presently will send thy soul to heaven. One thing we forget about this play, and sometimes it takes a live performance in a theater to remind us, is how funny this play is in many places. And it comes out of dramatic irony, a lot of it. But I'm going to sort of be at pains to point out places where the history tips over a little bit into comedy for a while. All right. Oh, yes. Somebody say something? Okay. Clarence is packed off in the care of Brackenbury, who is the warden of the Tower, and he's going to be sort of taken off the chessboard until Richard can find a way to get at him. And he says the next thing to do is Anne. Anne is the widow of the young Prince Edward, who should have. Now, here we get into the many, many names which are shared by two or three different characters. This Edward is not the Edward who reigns as king, but the Edward who was the son of King Henry VI and his bride, Margaret of Anjou, and was murdered after the Battle of Tewkesbury. Now, this will be important eventually because history will tell us probably simply that Edward died in that battle, the Battle of Tewkesbury, which was essentially the climactic battle of the War of the Roses. Shakespeare personalizes it. He has him murdered after the battle by all three brothers, that is to say, Edward, who is soon to be king, Clarence and Richard all stab him one after the other. Likewise, Henry VI, some time after this, died in the Tower of London. It's not known what he died of. It seems likely he may have been more or less starved to death or died of neglect. But Shakespeare obviously wants to make things as dramatic as possible, so he implicates Richard directly in the killing of Edward and then makes him the sole assassin who kills Henry VI. So, when Lady Anne is seen, whom Shakespeare gilds the lily a little bit by having her actually escorting the coffin of Henry VI to its burial, you have to realize that Shakespeare, throughout the first part of this play, is compressing events of about 12 years into a narrative that makes it seem that everything is happening very fast. He doesn't get specific about dates, but if you read your history, you'll find that, X happened actually 3 or 4 years before the apparent immediately following scene in Shakespeare. That's the liberties he's taking as a writer of historical fiction, if you will. But the major facts of the history are undisputed, and that is that Lady Anne was the widow of Edward, who died at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Her father-in-law was Henry VI, and that she did eventually go on to marry Richard as his queen. Because someone, maybe it was Peter Buffy, you there, Peter? Was it you that said you wanted to talk about the turnaround with Anne? It might have been you.
Yes, definitely. I've been
Yeah,
thinking a lot about it.
right. So Shakespeare is handed a history. The fact is that Anne went on to marry the new king, Richard III, of the party that had disinherited and killed both her husband and her father-in-law. Now, Shakespeare ups the ante by having him personally involved in both killings. But he has to somehow make it plausible that Richard, with his Machiavellian wiles, can get under Anne's skin to the degree that, in a scene which lasts no more than 20 minutes, he goes from being her object of derision, scorn, and hatred to a point at which she's just about to consent to go to bed with him. And that's very characteristic of Richard, that he says, "This is impossible. I couldn't possibly do this. Could I? Watch me." And he goes on to do exactly that. Now, whether you find it credible or not, it's in Shakespeare's interest to make it at least plausible. And therefore, he gives us this wonderful scene in which she is spitting at him, reviling him. You know, if I had a sword at hand, I would kill you. And get to the point at which she hasn't yet said yes, but her final words in the scene are somewhat seductive. Here's a little detour into Elizabethan English. Elizabethan English still had what English today no longer has, which is the distinction between thee and thou on the one hand and you on the other. In fact, if you've seen the McKellen film, you found that they did away with all, if you've been reading along and say, hey, they've done away with all the these and thous and substituted yous. McKellen said, I want to make it more accessible to people, and they were setting it in something that looked like the 1930s. But I think they lost something. Although it's possible that a modern English or American audience doesn't completely appreciate it. Because when Anne first confronts Richard, and if you want to follow along here, this is Act 1, Scene 2. The first thing she says to him is, "Avaunt, thou dreadful minister of hell! Thou hadst but power over his mortal body. His soul thou canst not have, therefore be gone." Now, there's sort of two classes in which Elizabethan English uses thee and thou instead of you. One is when you're speaking to servants and inferiors. The other, however, is in speaking to people to whom you are trying to demonstrate utter condescension and scorn and what's stronger than disapproval? Condemnation. So throughout the whole first of this scene, she is throwing these and thous at him, which basically mean you're a peasant, you're below my notice, you're subhuman. And this continues, and Richard counters by using you language. Lady, you know no rules of charity, which renders good for bad, blessings for curses. And then he says, let's see, lady, I did that one. Uh, he speaks to her rather formally and with respect, and she's still theeing and thouing him, like hitting him over the head. In thy foul throat thou liest, she says, and going on, rehashing, as this play constantly does, the events of Henry VI, Part 3. Because the history is twisted and difficult, and Shakespeare knows people keep needing little prompts to be reminded of who did what. Dost grant me, hedgehog, then God grant me too, thou mayst be damned. Then something interesting happens. He shifts his tone, and from you he goes to thee, but not the scornful thee that she uses. This is the thee that Romeo and Juliet use when you have given your heart to someone. It starts with your beauty was the cause of that effect, but very soon it's these eyes could not endure thy beauty's rack. And later, he that bereft thee, lady, of thy husband, did it to help thee to a better husband. They're both using thou, thee with each other, but with completely different intents. Hers is contempt and scorn, his is lover's language. And on it goes through, arise, dissembler, though I wish thy death, I would not be thy executioner, then bid me kill myself, and I will do it. These eyes could not endure thy beauty's rack. And the scene is in this strange balance for a while until finally, if you're looking along, this would be around line 196 or so. No, 192. There's a pause after he says, to both their deaths shalt thou be accessory, saying, because I killed them for love, because I wanted you so badly. It sounds absurd to the sense, and yet it's made plausible by the language that he uses and the refusal to sort of rise to her level of anger and just persist in this romantic overture. And finally, there's this funny little sequence of short lines starting in my version at 192. I would I knew thy heart, 'tis figured in my tongue. I fear me both are false. Well, put up your sword. They're sort of half Alexandrines, if you want to get technical about it. An Alexandrine is a 6-foot line as opposed to the usual 5-foot pentameter, and they're perfectly balanced. And the scene is hanging in the balance here until he says, vouchsafe to wear this ring. In some versions, she says, to take is not to give. And then it's, see how my ring encompasseth thy finger. And her resistance is down. If she's going to let him put a ring on her finger, you see that she has given in on some basic level. He doesn't seduce her on the spot, literally. You couldn't very well do it on the Shakespearean stage anyway. But when she leaves, very interestingly, she has shifted into you language. With all my heart, this is at line 219, and much it joys me too to see you are so penitent. And a minute later, since you teach me how to flatter you, imagine I have said farewell already. In the chivalric tradition, when the lady says you to the gentleman, it's mildly encouraging, still formal, and not in love yet, but invites further discourse. So, the degree to which she has been won over is moot. It'll change, it'll be different from production to production, but we soon learn that she has married him. We also later learn that she is, quote, sick and like to die, and then eventually that Anne, my wife, hath bid this world good night without a shade of emotion to it. So it's clear that she is seen by him as a stepping stone to consolidating his power. But he has already said, you know, he can play the lover as he can play any other role that is advantageous to him. And she, when he is crowned, she has played the role that he wanted her to play, and she has validated his reign, and now she can be disposed of. In fact, he then starts talking about a second marriage to the daughter, whom we barely see, of the widowed Queen Elizabeth. So his wheels never stop turning. Okay, that's his next beat. He's now won the Lady Anne. Did you put up your hand, Peter?
Yeah, because I kind of don't buy it. I'm of
Sure.
I would like to call Shakespeare bluff.
Yeah.
You know, it fits his needs dramaturgically, but you know, and I don't have my argument is not with the accuracy or inaccuracy of the history, or even the you know, depths of human depravity. But her character seems so unconvincing. Her when she's accompanying the coffin is pure crocodile tears, or is how can she make that? It seems implausible to me that she's making this transition so quickly. And I know that I can see I agree with your usefulness of that, but we don't have any. She's not in the Henrys as far as I know. She doesn't speak. So we have a great pretext for his behavior.
Yeah.
Total.
Okay. You know, I'll address that. I'll say, yes, we may find it very implausible. Shakespeare has tried doing pretty much the impossible to make a scene about an angry, furious widow turn around in a matter of minutes. I will say that if you work with the play uncut, the scene plays longer than it does in most of the film versions you see, and there is more opportunity for Richard to work his magic on her. But if you don't believe it, you won't believe it, and you know you'll have to say, okay, this is a shortcoming of the play. I won't go with him there. The fact is, of course, that Anne did marry Richard and did reign briefly as Queen of England.
Well, I think that I would so much is going to depend upon the interpretation, the acting, and so I'd love to see 10 different ends and study it that way. It's not that I totally reject it. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But basically, it doesn't settle.
Well, that is the task of every actor, actress, and director who tackle this play, to try to give it as much plausibility as they can. And I certainly sympathize with your inability to stretch your credibility that far.
Julian?
Yeah.
Linda Hobbit has her hand up, and I think Charlotte, did you have your hand up? No. Okay, Linda.
Yeah. Okay.
Linda.
Well, I have a comment on that as well, and that is, and I don't know how aware the audience at the time would have been, but my guess is, I mean, the position of women in that society there, she was extremely vulnerable, and my guess is that she took that his proposal as her really her only option.
Yeah.
And there and certainly you see that kind of with Ophelia as well, and probably some of the other women. So I think that it might have been more plausible to the Shakespeare's audience.
Yeah. And in a feminist era, it's hard to make that case, but Anne is a woman who has lost her husband, has lost, her, is basically alone in the world. And she's presumably led a life of some comfort as the wife of the Prince of Wales. And I'm sure Richard and his cronies could see to it that she was not getting a lot of, wherewithal to continue living. So that one argument you can make is that she needs to attach herself to a man just in order to make the rest of her life tolerable. And that's one small step. Probably it isn't enough for Peter, but uh, again, I think Shakespeare does what he can to first make the transition nearly impossible and then to actually achieve it. I think I'll leave it at that. Okay, now we go on into a court scene. And the court is in crisis because the king is ailing. Things have never really settled down in this court. They think they've defeated the Lancastrians, although Margaret seems to be allowed to range around pretty much anywhere she wants to go. And there's still a lot of animosity among the traditional members of the family toward the Woodvilles, the Rivers, Dorset, and Grey, the kin of Elizabeth the Queen. So there's a lot of sort of wrangling under the surface, and we're going to see eventually Edward, before his death, try to deal with this and try to heal some of the wounds. So Richard breaks into this colloquy, which is already a little testy, and he comes on very strong. Right here. This is about this is Act 1, Scene 3, line 41. And he blows in, already angry and intimidating people. They do me wrong, and I will not endure it. Who is it that complains unto the king that I, forsooth, am stern and love them not? Forsooth, as Shakespeare uses it, is sort of an interjection like, for God's sake. Can you believe it? And because I cannot flatter and look fair, smile in men's faces, smooth, deceive, and cog, duck with French nods and apish courtesy, everything that we have already seen him perfectly capable of doing. He says, but I can't do that. And then so everybody dislikes me. Poor crippled me. This is always a trump card that he can pull, is that, first of all, nature cursed me with these disabilities, and now nobody will let me forget them. Everybody holds them against me. And he tangles with the Queen, brother of Gloucester, you mistake the matter. The king, in his own royal disposition, and not provoked by any suitor else, makes him to send that he may learn the ground. And Richard brings up the old family saw about, you just married him to advance yourself and your family. And that's why nobody likes you, and that's why nobody likes them. Um, and it's to be remembered now that she is the mother of young Edward, who would be Edward V, and his younger brother, the Duke of York, who have been sent off to the provinces, to Ludlow, I think, or someplace good. So she's separated from her children, and Richard is probably behind that. And now Queen Margaret begins to lurk at the fringes here. Now, this is ahistorical. Once again, Shakespeare is taking liberties here. The real Margaret was banished from England, and long before the coronation of Richard, she had died in France in exile. But she's very useful. She is one of the very few characters, I think I've only been able to identify 3 or 4, who appear in 4 different Shakespeare plays. She was introduced at the end of Henry VI, Part 1. She's a major character in Parts 2 and 3, and now here she is again, although historically she's dead. And Dakin Matthews, who ran the Berkeley Shakespeare Festival back in the 80s and put on a production of this play in which he played a very, very good Richard. Dakin sort of implied, made a nod, let's say, in the direction of history by having Margaret appear as a kind of a ghost. She looked like she'd just gotten out of her coffin, heavily made up. The actress's name is Laura Dolis. Some of you know her. And almost like an apparition, so that it was as if the memory of the Yorkist crimes from years past had come out of the grave and was still plaguing them. But let's deal with it as he intended it, as that she's an aging woman who has seen her power snatched away. She had ruled as Queen of England for quite a while. She has an affair with the Earl of Suffolk, but let's not go into that. She also has led her own armies into battle and to ultimate defeat at the hands of the Yorkists. And now she's just seen as this presence that hangs around representing the past. And she is, among really all the characters, she seems the one who is freest to really speak to Richard as who he is. And it's she that is going to use lots of foul bunchback toad and let me see, the stay dog, for thou shalt hear me, the worm of conscience still begnaw thy soul, elvish marked abortive rooting hog. She just has a huge amount of invective to pile upon him, because she is the only surviving voice of the previous administration, if you like, of the Lancastrians, now defeated and in disarray. Except that, unbeknownst to most of us at this point, there's been a Welsh gentleman named Owen Tudor, whose son, the Earl of Richmond, has married one of the surviving Lancastrian princesses and is going to make a claim for the crown eventually based on that. And as many of you know, he will be successful and reign as Henry VII and the father of Henry VIII. Okay. I'm not going to dwell on this scene very long, except that it airs a lot of old dirty laundry. It reminds us once again that the repercussions of the Wars of the Roses have not ended, even if the hostilities have, and that that the victorious Yorkists are still constantly being reminded that not everyone accepts their right to the throne. She also goes off on Elizabeth. I'm not going to go into that right now. There's a trick in which she is. This is at about line 230. She has been berating Richard with every name you can call him. Thou slander of thy heavy mother's womb, thou loathed issue of thy father's loins, thou rag of honor, thou detested. And he says, Margaret, and throws her off her rhythm. And she says, Richard? Say, ha, I call thee not. I cry thee mercy then. And rhetorically, at least, because rhetoric is very important in this play, rhetorically, he has taken his curse and turned it back on her, which discomfits her because she's the kind of witchy woman who believes that her curses have real force. And he's managed to disrupt it and misdirect it back at herself. I'm going on, however, to we start seeing the Earl of Buckingham for the first time, and Buckingham is going to be a very important character, possibly the second most important male character after Richard in this. He's a member of the court who early along sees what Richard is up to and decides that that's the side to be on. And we'll see him through several succeeding scenes learning how to insinuate himself and ally himself with Richard's program. I'm looking now at the time, it's 6:16. I'm going to go on here for another 20 or 25 minutes, and then I'm going to open up to questions. I'm hoping to make it to the coronation, but I probably won't. So Richard, at the end of the scene we've just been speaking of course, he has another soliloquy, and there's a beautiful sort of self-description of his technique here, which I think is worth repeating. This is at line 331 of Act 1, Scene 3. Now they believe it, and withal whet me to be revenged on Rivers, Dorset, Grey. But then I sigh, and with a piece of scripture tell them that God bids us do good for evil. And thus I clothe my naked villainy with odd old ends stolen forth of holy writ, and seem a saint when most I play the devil. So every once in a while he comes back and reminds us, that he says, I can change shapes with Proteus for advantages. That was in that same passage from Henry VI. Proteus is a shape changer in Greek mythology. He constantly harps on his ability to be all things to all men and women. Again, he says, I counterfeit the tragedian. I can assume whatever role is necessary, including pious religiousness, which we'll see later in the scene in which he insinuates himself with the commons. Whatever the role requires, I will slip into it. And watch me because it's fascinating. The implication here is you can't take your eyes off me, can you? Because you can't imagine what I'm going to do next. And the very impossibility of the task, which was set forth again in the long soliloquy from Henry, like being lost in a thicket of thorns, is somehow or other, though it seems impossible, I'm going to find my way through. And you ask yourself, how can he do it? Well, I'll show you. So now we return back to Clarence. Clarence is in prison, but he's still senior to Richard in the succession, as is Edward now on the throne. And brilliantly, I think, and this is Shakespearean stagecraft here, Richard finds a way to essentially kill two birds with one stone. And that will occupy us over the next two or three scenes because we've seen Clarence pass by, whose name is George, by the way. Remember George, Duke of Clarence? Seen him pass by on his way to the tower. He's presumably been imprisoned in the tower for some length of time, as historically he was. And now come two characters only identified as murderers. If you're in the audience, you just see two guys walk on stage. But the fact that reading it, you see enter two murderers sort of tips off where we're going. And so he basically has the warrant, which he has obtained for Clarence's execution, which they will need to carry with him. It's at least is a document that will let them into his cell to see him. And it probably has an attachment that that amounts to a death sentence. And he warns them, which sort of whets our interest for the next scene. He says, do not hear him plead, for Clarence is well spoken, and perhaps may move your hearts to pity if you mark him. And the murderer, who seems bent on deserving his character title, says, "Tut, tut, my lord, we will not stand to prate. Talkers are no good doers. Be assured, we go to use our hands and not our tongues." And he says, "Oh, your eyes drop millstones when fools' eyes fall tears." Never quite understood that line, but it's evocative of fake sorrow over what they're about to do. So, about your business straight, he sends them off, and we are now in the prison, in the tower. And Brackenbury, who is a jailer, but basically a sympathetic character, is by Clarence as he wakes up from a nightmare. And he's obviously very shaken by it. "Oh, I have passed a miserable night, so full of fearful dreams, of ugly sights, that as I am a Christian faithful man, I would not spend another such a night, though 'twere to buy a world of happy days." It's just, he's had very little sleep, and what sleep he has been plagued by nightmares. And when Brackenbury asks him to tell the nightmare, it's several things at once. It's obviously a working out of his guilt, because don't want to go into this too intricately, but he switched sides twice during the Wars of the Roses. He was obviously with his brothers as a Yorkist against the Lancasters. Then he switched over, fought with the Lancaster side for a while. Then he switched back. So he's left a sense of betrayal on both sides. He's left a lot of enemies behind him and a lot of people that suffered because of his deeds. And plagued by this, he has a dream which is also prophetic, because he said, I was on a ship in the English Channel, and I was on, my brother Gloucester was with me, and suddenly he stumbled and fell, but as he did, he sort of grabbed at me, knocked me overboard. "Oh, that's terrible. You dreamed you drowned." "No, it was worse than that, because I drowned, but I was still alive. And I sank to the bottom of the sea." And there's this Baroque image of treasure and wrecked ships at the bottom of the sea. And then suddenly there are these apparitions of the people he betrayed, including old Warwick, who is his father-in-law, because he himself married Lady Anne's sister. And Warwick he betrayed as well. So Warwick points at him and says, "Seize on him, devils," and demons grabbed me and started to pull me apart. And then I woke up. And Brackenbury is sympathetic, But ultimately, he says, keeper, I have done those things that now give evidence against my soul for Edward's sake, and see how he requites me. His brother has thrown him in jail after all the things that I have done for him, not mentioning the time that I was on the opposite side. Uh, Clarence has a great deal to be repentant about. And in come our murderers now, and they hand Brackenbury, or the keeper, the piece of paper that says, give us access to Duke of Clarence and basically make yourself scarce. If you run a prison and somebody hands you a warrant like that, you know what it's about. And you probably also know that it is pointless to resist. So Brackenbury just says, I wash my hands, do what you have to do. And they go in, and they could, as one of the murderers says, knock him more the mazzard. Is it, what shall we, stab him as he sleeps? No, he'll say, 'twas done cowardly when he wakes. You'll see that the dialogue here has between these two has shifted into prose. Now, Shakespeare does several things with prose. One of them is comedy. One of them is lower class dialogue, which these people certainly are. It's also, it lacks the dramatic sweep of verse, so that it's characteristic of people working out problems. So the two of them have this problem and say, here's this guy, he has to be dead by the time we leave. How are we going to do this? And it would have been much simpler if, when one said, let's stab him as he sleeps, okay, let's do it. End of story. However, they delay. It appears that one of the murderers, the one called number one, is pretty gung-ho and pretty dependably will do what Richard wants. The other one is conflicted. And they spend some time sort of talking about, yes, we have a warrant to do this, but is it the right thing to do? What, art thou afraid? Says the first murderer. And the second says, not to kill him, having a warrant, but to be damned for killing him, from the which no warrant can defend me. And he's getting wobbly. So the first murderer says, I'll back to the Duke of Gloucester and tell him so. No, don't do that, please. This passionate humor of mine will change. Faith, some certain dregs of conscience are yet within me. And here at line 120, it'll be different in different editions, but around line 120, he's just about to jump ship when the first murderer says, remember our reward when the deed's done. Zoons, he dies. I'd forgot the reward. That's a comic moment. Not everyone will laugh at it, but it's like, I really shouldn't do this. I really shouldn't do this. Remember the money. Okay, we're good. And followed up with, Zoons, he dies. I had forgot the reward. Where's thy conscience now? Oh, in the Duke of Gloucester's purse. So we're getting a little comedy out of these guys. And it looks like the comedy might continue. But then Clarence wakes up and an interesting thing happens. He calls out first, where art thou, keeper? Give me a cup of wine. This is the first thing he wants to do on waking up is get drunk if he can, because his life in prison is pretty miserable. And the second murderer says, you shall have wine enough, my lord, anon. This is a foreshadowing. The first murderer has already said, we'll drown him in the Malmsey butt in the next room, a big barrel full of Malmsey wine. It is a tradition in British history that the Duke of Clarence died drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine. I suspect it's embroidered. I suspect it was like a street saying, "Oh, the Duke of Clarence died. Oh, what did he do? Drown himself in a barrel?" That seems the most likely way that that legend grew up. But as you'll see in the Olivier film, theater seems to take it seriously. And it is true if you have a large enough barrel and enough liquid in it, and you stuff somebody in it head first, he's going to be dead before long. So that's how it plays out in Shakespeare's play. Um, all right, let's checking the time. I've got another 10 minutes or so. So this scene goes on, and I'm not going to go into it in any more detail, except it's interesting that once Clarence starts making a defense for himself, all three characters go back into verse. And I think that has to do with the stakes of the scene. Now, suddenly someone's life is at stake. So it's understandable that in that swell of emotion and desperation, Clarence, in Shakespearean terms, would go into verse because verse is the vehicle for strong emotion. But it's interesting that the murderers follow him there. And in a sense, they lose a little of their character, which was joking and indirect in the preceding scene. And now they get involved in a legal argument. And I think probably Clarence went to law school at some point in his career because he's sort of making all of these very cogent legal arguments for why you really shouldn't be doing this. And finally, it comes down to perhaps the second murderer is showing signs of starting to give in, and the first murderer says, "Look behind you, my lord," which is sort of the most transparent thing. And it can mean one of two things. It could mean that the second murderer has finally got his gumption up and is moving in on him, or that the first murderer is trying to distract him so that he himself can kill him. In any case, they go ahead, they stab him, they take him into the next room, they upend him into a barrel full of wine, and so much for Clarence. And once again, in the scene that follows, which remains in verse, by the way, because perhaps you can only speculate about why Shakespeare uses verse sometimes and prose other times. But to me, what this means is that the emotions that have been raised in the second murderer by the guilt now of doing something that he really knew was deeply wrong have elevated his speech into the verse which more cogently conveys his sense of remorse. And his remorse is real because he says, "Take thou the fee," says the first murderer, "and tell him what I say, sorry, the second murderer, he says, "Take thou the fee, and tell him what I say, for I repent me that the Duke is slain." He doesn't even want any part of the money now. And he knows that they have done a crime, even though they had a warrant for it. Okay, we get back to the court. And Edward is mending some fences. And it's been said already that, he doesn't have very long to go. And I think Edward is feeling his death to be near. And he wants to clean his conscience as much as he can. No one in this play has any right to a clean conscience, given to what they've been doing and done to them over the last 20 years. Everyone is compromised. Everyone has done an atrocity of one kind or another to their adversaries. And Edward really wants a clean slate before he departs. So, "Why so? Now have I done a good day's work. We're at Act 2, Scene 1. You peers continue this united league. I every day expect an embassage from my Redeemer, and any day now I'll be gone. So let's clean this up. And he basically makes A shake hands with B and B shake hands with C and D and so forth. Unless you've been through the preceding plays or are paying very close attention, you probably don't know the grudges that these people are holding against each other. If you dig back, several acts, but all the way back into Henry VI Part 2, you'll know why A hates B and has to be told to shake hands with him. And I believe that it's a scene that's suffused in irony. Rivers, for instance, who's one of the Queen's kindred, is told to shake hands with Lord Hastings, says, by heaven, my soul is purged from grudging hate, and with my hand I seal my true heart's love. And Hastings says, so thrive I as I truly swear the like. And this is repeated over and over, Rivers and Hastings, and then with Dorset and Hastings, and then with Buckingham and Derby, I think. So the whole court is basically compelled to go through this ritual of whatever animus I had against you, whatever hatred, I'm putting it behind me. I want to shake your hand. I want to be friends for the king's benefit. It's basically an act of theater. It's very rich for actors because if you've done your homework and know what reason Rivers has to hate Hastings, which is strewn over several scenes in the preceding play, then you know what it is you're being forced to say to somebody whom you loathe and whom you would rather cut your hand off than shake hands with him. And the scene is full of those hidden subtexts because people are saying one thing, but it is all for show. It's all to make nice for the king, so as not to rile him or, speed his demise any faster. And in comes Henry into this festival of forgiveness and amity. And he says, me too, I want to do this too. And he has a long speech. Among this princely heap, this is line 52, if any here by false intelligence or wrong surmise hold me a foe, if I unwittingly or in my rage have aught committed that is hardly borne by any in this presence, I desire to reconcile me to his friendly peace. And he goes around shaking hands with everybody, some of whom are people who he intends to kill in the next two acts. You, Lord Rivers, and of Dorset, all these, there's a litany of people who are going to be executed over the following hour or two. Dukes, earls, lords, gentlemen, indeed of all, I do not know that Englishman alive with whom my soul is any jot at odds more than the infant that is born tonight. I thank my God for my humility. And not only we in the audience, but 2/3 of the people on stage know how bogus this is. But for Edward's sake, this pantomime of reconciliation is being carried on, although no one is really committed to it. And this is a dramatic irony, which again treads close to comedy. Sometimes as an actor, you'll be playing something and you play it, or you think, according to the the wishes of the playwright. And suddenly there's a laugh there and you had no idea it was coming. And this is that kind of scene because the audience is in on the joke. The audience can see the falsity of these reconciliations. And sort of the more they're pushed and the more florid clerical language is used to dress them up as something they are not, which is true forgiveness and reconciliation, the disparity very often will make us laugh. So on the surface, everybody is copacetic. We've cleaned up all of those little petty jealousies that pervade our court, and now we can move on until Richard says, until actually the Queen says, I do beseech your highness to take our brother Clarence to your grace. As long as everybody is being forgiven, you could forgive your brother for whatever it was you locked him up for. And Richard drops his little hydrogen bomb. Why, madam, have I offered love for this? To be so flouted in this royal presence? Who knows not that the gentle Duke is dead? And of course, of the people present, the only one who knows that is Richard. And just a great line, I think, by Edward himself. He says, who knows not he is dead? Who knows he is? And Richard carefully explains that, oh, yes, I know there were two warrants, and the first one said, chop off his head, and the second one said, no, forgive him, but for some reason, the second one arrived awfully slow, whereas the first one, and again, a wonderful irony here, he says, he, poor man, by your first order died, and that a winged Mercury did bear. Some tardy cripple bear the countermand. And he's practically giving himself away. He's saying, well, that's because the countermand, of course, is in his inside pocket, and he has chosen not to pass it on. And the king is so afflicted by this that he more or less drops dead on the spot. Not quite. He has a speech, and the speech is full of self-recrimination and recrimination of everybody else. I'm not going to read it now, but he reminds himself of that until Clarence crossed him up, he was a loyal brother. He did everything for me, and saved my life once in battle. And for what moved me, to sign my name to a death warrant for him, even though I changed my mind later. I will never forgive myself for that. He leaves the stage, and in 2 minutes later, he's reported to be dead. So that the death of Clarence and the death of Edward, which historically I think are 5 years apart, Shakespeare consolidates into a single action. And now the biggest obstacle really is gone. The two older brothers, in a moment, essentially, are removed from the board. And now Richard really only has to worry about the princes, Elizabeth's and Edward's sons, who are historically, I think, about 8 and 11, something like that at this time. And they are the next target. So we move on. Now, I'm going to kind of speed through the middle of the play, starting now and continuing into next week, because there are a number of short scenes that will be cut in most of the film versions that you see, because I wouldn't call them filler. I'd say they're big on pathos because a lot of them involve children. For instance, Act 2, Scene 2 is about Clarence's two children who do not yet know that they've been orphaned. There's pathos in that, and it brings Elizabeth and the Duchess of York. Duchess of York, remember, is Richard's and Clarence's and Edward's mother. She saw her husband murdered in the beginning of Henry VI, Part 3, by Margaret, or with Margaret's collusion. Um, and we're going to hear more from her because for a couple of reasons. One is that Richard is going to use her to impugn the legitimacy of the princes in the Tower, because he's going to say that Edward himself, our just dead king, was illegitimate because my father was on business somewhere, and comparing the dates, it would appear that it's impossible that he was the father of the baby named Edward, so that his reign is illegitimate, and therefore his two sons are illegitimate. There's a wonderful scene a little later, I can't find it right now, in which he speaks to Catesby and says, now I want you to go spread this rumor, that my father had no knowledge of a pregnancy by his wife Elizabeth, because he was out of town, and then he ends up saying, but be nice in the way you phrase it, for as you know, my mother lives. I'd really like to spare Mom the calumny that would come on her by my essentially saying she committed adultery with my father, excuse me. I try to stay out of the weeds in this, in all these dynastic dead ends and side roads, but I hope you're more or less staying with me.
I have a question from John,
Yeah.
John Citron, which kind of is about what you just said, this
Good.
dynasty thing. John, you want to ask your question? Unmute, please. Yeah.
You're muted.
Now I'm trying to find where I wrote it here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in the
Here we
chat.
go.
Mhm.
Were you alluded to this earlier, but were the attendees really sophisticated and educated enough to know the history behind Richard III and the previous reigns?
That's a great question. And I think pretty much that is, first of all, as I say, a lot of them would have seen the three parts of Henry VI, which contains all of this history. At the same time, I keep noticing that Shakespeare never seems to miss a chance to sort of go over the story one more time. And you'll find it throughout the play that we'll find it, for instance, in those litanies with the women, in which I had an Edward till a Richard killed him. I had a Richard till an Edward killed him. Shakespeare must have known that having so many people having the same first name was going to be confusing. So I think partly he's depending on his audience to have been educated by his earlier play, because they probably didn't read Holinshed's Chronicles or Edward Hall's history of the Wars of the Roses, which were the contemporary published books that he used for most of his source. And the common theater goer, very likely illiterate, would not have read those books. So what he knew about the story would have been from Shakespeare's own previous plays and plays by other playwrights, because history plays were very common. There was a Richard III before Shakespeare's Richard III. There was a Henry V play before Shakespeare's Henry V. They loved mining their history, especially their dynastic history, for good
I have a
stories.
question related to that.
Uh-huh.
So Act One is huge in this play. It's more than twice the length of Act Two and Act Five.
Yeah.
Is he front loading exposition in that first act that's part of filling in the audience about the history? Do you think
I
that's
think
going on?
I think to some degree, but as you'll see, he continues doing it through the play. He sort of never misses, right up to the battlefield when ghosts appear to Richard. Even they are recapitulating old material. So thematically, I think he's saying is great guilts for great crimes never die. You can't put them to bed. They will always rise up again. But also, I think he's, leading his audience through once again, the thicket of thorns, the, uh, the confusing details of this history, because frankly, I have been studying this for 50 years and I still have to sort of sit down and say, his father is who? It's a complex story. And he's looking for a way through it to sort of tell his main story with enough context so that we don't lose sight of who is who.
I have a second question,
Yeah.
while other people may have questions. Um, it seems that because Richard's kind of played like he is an actor, he takes on personalities, he can shape shift, and because he comes across as this absolute villain, but yet I feel like Shakespeare really likes him. And maybe because he is such a good actor and he's playing out extremes in the character of Richard, that someone who might be interested in a person who has no moral limits, what could they get away with? What could they do? Do you think there's something like that Shakespeare's actually drawn to this figure? And especially because Richard had such
Absolutely.
a bad
The,
personality or bad
yeah,
reputation.
way above, in my opinion, in the theater, way above considerations of good and evil is the consideration of theatricality, of you can't take your eyes off the guy. And I think that's what's built in. I think that's what's unique about Richard's character. There'd been, vice villains or Machiavellian villains before him, but Shakespeare makes him so protean, so, to steal another, uh, uh, such a brilliant improviser, uh, so completely unrestrained by moral considerations. I'm looking for something like uh, moral saws, the sort of tired old morality that everybody knows because we all were taught it from little, that you turn the other cheek and you repay evil with kindness, and his rejection of that sort of standard moral structure is so electric, is so fully inhabited. I'll start out next week by trying to find better words to express this in. But he is a monster in some ways, and monsters have always, look at Frankenstein, look at King Kong. There's something in us that wants to reach out to uh, fulfill our fascination with the monstrosity. Um, I'll find better words to express this in. That'll be my kickoff for the next class.
Mhm,
I may go to some more articulate writers than myself to try to spell it out. I feel it. I think it has to do, as I said, with the proximity to the audience and the way that the actor playing Richard can mesmerize the audience. And So that in some weird way, even as he's doing terrible, terrible things, we're rooting for him because he's the most interesting and vital thing on stage.
Ah, let's see. I have a question from Martina. Martina, you want to ask it? And anybody else have a question before we close up? Jocelyn, do you have a question? So let's do Martina and then Jocelyn and Peter. Martina, unmute, please.
Okay. Do you think some of these characters that you've described, I mean, that like with Richard III being able to shapeshift as you have said, do you think he wrote some of these characters or was influenced by some of his own actors that he wanted to showcase them because they had the kind of personality that he wanted to project to the audience?
I'm reading right now a book about the theater, which is the building that this play probably was first presented in. Eventually, it's outside the city limits, so it was legal because the city fathers of London hated theater and wouldn't allow it to happen in the city. So this was out in Smithfield, which is out Bishopsgate, I think. I forget the names of all the city gates, but outside the walls, medieval walls of the city, and therefore had a different legal status. So that's where they built a couple of theaters, the Theater and the Curtain. And I mentioned that the theater was built by James Burbage. His son, Richard Burbage, became the lead actor in Shakespeare's company. And I mentioned some of the roles he played, originated. There's every indication, I think, that Richard Burbage and Shakespeare worked very closely together. And I suspect they were good friends. In fact, Burbage named his own children after roles that he had played in Shakespeare's plays. I don't have the book by my elbow right now, so I can't tell you all of them, but he obviously his role as lead actor in the leading company in London at the time was central to his own identity. Shakespeare knew what he could do, so I think he is consciously writing this role for Richard Burbage and knowing what a electric and riveting actor Burbage must have been.
Mm. So there's a question for Peter and Sharon.
Yeah.
Peter, you want to unmute?
I had a difficulty with this idea that the princes could be bastards. That how could Edward IV, having those princes in the palace, how could he be convinced that they were not his own issue?
Actually, I may not have made it clear. The imputation of bastardy is not for the children, but for Edward himself.
Oh.
That is to say that his father, Richard, Duke of York, was not, could not have been the father of Edward.
However, in the text of the play, he says those bastards in the tower.
Correct. Bastards, grand bastards, if you like.
Right. So,
Bastards of the second generation, I think is what he means.
okay.
Or it's just his way. It's easier to think of killing them if he just starts calling them bastards, you know. Says, well, their whole line is illegitimate, so who cares who does away with them? And of course, in the next class, we'll sort of come to grips with the child murders and who signs off on them and who carries them out and who regards them as the greatest crimes of the Middle Ages, you know. So
one final question from John Citron. You want to
Yep.
unmute John and make your point and question?
Yes. In the wonderful Alec Guinness film, Kind Hearts and Coronets,
yep.
an aggrieved fellow wishing to regain his family's aristocratic position starts serially bopping off those ahead of him in line. Was anything made of a connection to the play Richard III? It's the first time I've even thought along those lines.
I don't think so. I know the film of which you speak, and I know there's other versions of it. This is one of the so-called Ealing comedies, I think, with Alec Guinness, which are classic. But I'll bring up another one. There is a Vincent Price film called Theater of Blood, and Vincent Price plays a terrible Shakespearean actor who has been lambasted by critics over the years. And he plots to murder them one by one in murders taken from Shakespeare plays. So, for instance,
Yay!
one of them is chopped up and baked into a pie, like from Titus Andronicus, and another is drowned in a butt of Malmsey, and so forth. So sort of the serial revenge theme is not limited to Shakespeare, but I think, yeah, they all have kind of echoes of Richard III to them.
Just a final comment. I think Sherry saw Al Pacino play Richard III. Is that right, Sherry, in 1971?
Wow.
Oh,
Yeah,
Where was it, Sherry?
Broadway. She's muted. Unmute, Sherry.
Sorry. My memory was that we were in a tiny theater, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, it
I
wouldn't have
saw
been
it
Broadway.
off Broadway. Well, the Google says he played at the Court Theater, which is on Broadway, if I remember correctly. So it might have been moved to Broadway, but my memory is I saw it in a near front row in a small theater that I thought was off Broadway.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was.
He was so intense, but
I bet.
the spraying danger of being in the front row.
Yeah.
Yes, Janie knows whereof you speak, because that's how she meant me.
But I also saw Kevin Spacey, and I was nearly in the front row, and he came right to the edge of the show. It was powerful.
Well, speaking both of Pacino and Spacey, how many of you have seen Looking for Richard? It's on my list.
I may have seen it. I don't remember anymore.
We screened it only 3 or 4 days ago. It's a very interesting sort of semi-documentary in which Pacino sort of looks into the play, tries out the role himself, brings in many of his friends, most of whom are New York method actors, and it's very, very interesting encounter to put together scenes from the play. And in a way, he sort of works through the play, the high points of the play as we know it.
How old was Pacino at the time making this film?
I think it was made in the 90s.
Oh, Looking for Richard.
I'd say the early 90s would be my guess. I think it's on my, if anybody has my letter that I sent out, I think I give a date for it.
We need to end.
I didn't see your letter, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll send it to you, Sherry. Okay, well, I think
It's right at the end when I'm talking about film versions, and
yeah,
don't have it to me at the moment.
See The Lost King too. That's fun.
Yeah.
So we'll meet again next Sunday for finishing up Richard, and
we'll start with Murdering the Kids. All right.
Oh, what a happy thing that will be.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll send the
fantastic night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all
Marty will
soon.
go out tomorrow.
Thanks, Julian.
Take
Okay,
care.
bye-bye everybody. Thanks a lot.